June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. A 12th-century stone church stood against the chaos of invasion, its ancient walls having weathered centuries, but never quite prepared for the violence that would sweep through this small village of Hangoville-au-Plain on the morning when Operation Overlord transformed the French countryside into a battlefield. What would happen inside that church over the next 2 days would challenge every assumption held by German military nurses about American medicine, about the nature of warfare itself, and about whether compassion could survive the collision between professional duty and human conscience, when everything around you was burning and men were screaming for help that might never come. The story begins not with the invasion itself, but with the long months of preparation, with wounded men arriving at medical facilities from across Nazi-occupied Europe, with German nurses who had been trained in a medical system fundamentally different from anything America possessed, a system where medical care was rationed by ideology and where some lives were deemed worthy of treatment, while others were left to die by deliberate policy. These German nurses, many of them veterans of years of brutal warfare on multiple fronts, had seen things that American medical personnel could barely imagine, had worked in hospitals where the principles governing who received treatment, and who did not bore little resemblance to the Hippocratic Oath or the Geneva Conventions that most civilized nations claim to respect. They had learned to compartmentalize their humanitarian instincts into categories that reflected Nazi ideology, separating worthy patients from those deemed unworthy, understanding their role not as healers bound by universal principles but as agents of a state that had decided medical care was a resource to be allocated based on racial theories and military usefulness, rather than human suffering. When these nurses finally encountered American medics, when they saw American doctors and hospital corpsmen treating German wounded with the same care and attention they gave to American soldiers, the experience created a cognitive dissonance so profound that it would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives, forcing them to confront questions about what medicine truly meant and whether their years of service had been in accordance with principles they could defend, so had been corrupted by the ideology of the nation they served. On the morning of D-Day, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division dropped into the darkness over Normandy with orders to secure objectives behind Utah Beach, to disrupt German reserves, to create confusion and chaos in the enemy's rear areas where the invasion force was most vulnerable. Among those paratroopers were 2 men whose names would be remembered by few but whose actions on that day would demonstrate something essential about American military medicine and about the choices individuals make when faced with suffering regardless of who carries the uniform. Robert E. Wright and Kenneth J. Moore were not combat soldiers, despite the fact that they wore the same uniform as combat infantrymen, carried the same weapons when circumstances demanded, and faced the same risk of enemy fire that would kill thousands of their comrades on that day. They were medics, trained in the treatment of combat wounds, equipped with morphine and sulfur powder and bandages, and most importantly, invested with a responsibility that transcended national boundaries and enemy status. Wright had landed in the swamps southeast of the main invasion beaches and spent hours wading through flooded terrain, treating paratroopers for wounds and parachute injuries before finding his way to the small village where his path would intersect with Moore's. Moore had arrived separately, following the sounds of fighting and the cries of wounded men, drawn towards suffering in a way that seemed to override every consideration of personal safety or military hierarchy. When both men found their way to the ancient church, they made an immediate decision that would define their entire medical response for the next 2 days. They would establish an aid station, a neutral place where the wounded could come regardless of which flag they served, regardless of which nation had issued their uniform, regardless of whether they were likely to live or die. They hung a Red Cross flag on the church door, a signal meant to mark protected space under international law, and began arranging the church to function as a hospital, despite lacking any of the equipment, supplies, or trained personnel that proper medical facilities required. The pews would serve as cots, the stone floor as surgical space, a nearby fountain as water source for cleaning wounds and washing away the blood and debris of battle. What they could not have known on that first morning was how their decision to maintain strict neutrality to insist that weapons remain outside the church, and to treat every wounded man who came through the door with the same professional care, regardless of uniform, would eventually become known to German medical personnel captured in the area, and how that knowledge would ultimately contribute to a transformation in how captured German nurses understood American military medicine. As the day progressed, and the fighting in and around Angoville-Plain intensified, with control of the village changing hands multiple times, as Americans and Germans each believed they were achieving breakthrough, the church became increasingly crowded with dying and wounded men. Word spread through the American paratroopers that medical help was available at the church, that Wright and Moore were working without rest, that even if you were hit in an artery and bleeding out, there was a chance if you could make it to that building. German soldiers, some of whom had been fighting in the area for hours and had seen comrades fall around them with no medical assistance available, also eventually learned that Americans at the church were treating German wounded with the same urgency and skill they applied to their own soldiers. This was unusual enough to warrant investigation when German paratroopers encountered the site, to cause momentary confusion when a German soldier entered carrying a machine gun, saw American medics working over both American and German casualties, and had to make a decision in seconds about how to respond to what seemed like a violation of every assumption about enemy soldiers. The decision he made proved crucial to what would happen next. Instead of opening fire, instead of treating the church as a military installation, where enemy soldiers were treating his wounded comrades and therefore a target worth destroying, the German soldier lowered his weapon and observed. By the time night fell on June 6th, and the seesaw fighting finally stabilized enough for a brief respite, Wright and Moore had treated more than 80 casualties, American and German and French, with wounds ranging from minor parachute injuries to traumatic amputations that would require amputation whether the man survived or not. The casualties continued through the night and into the next day, with both medics working without sleep for nearly 2 days straight, operating on the kind of adrenaline and determination that separates those who merely survive war from those who help others survive it. What made this medical response remarkable was not the technical competence, though Wright and Moore demonstrated the highest standards of battlefield medicine available in 1944, but rather the fundamental principle underlying their approach. American military medicine, as it had been taught, as it had been practiced in training, and as it was supposed to be executed in the field, operated under the assumption that medical personnel treated patients not as representatives of one nation or another, but as human beings requiring care. The Geneva Conventions, which America had adopted and which established international standards for the treatment of wounded, regardless of which side they had been fighting for, represented a principle about the universality of human suffering and the obligation of medical professionals to transcend nationality in providing treatment. This was not unique to America in theory. Germany had also signed the Geneva Conventions, had nominally committed to respecting the Red Cross symbol, had supposedly agreed to treat wounded enemies with the same care provided. By the time German military personnel captured in the Normandy campaign began moving through American medical facilities, initial reports of how American doctors and medics were handling German wounded had begun filtering through the prisoner system. When German nurses assigned to prisoner of war hospitals in England and the United States arrived to take charge of German soldiers being treated by American medical teams, their initial expectations often centered on discovering inadequate care, food shortages, deliberate withholding of medical attention, or the kind of casual brutality that had characterized so much of warfare on the Eastern Front, where both sides had abandoned any pretense of treating prisoners humanely. Instead, what many German nurses found was a carefully organized system of medical care that applied uniform standards regardless of whether the patient wore an American or German uniform, that provided medical treatment based on clinical need rather than nationality, and that included amenities and conditions that many American soldiers themselves would not have access to in their own military hospitals. A German nurse arriving at a field hospital in England to coordinate care for captured German soldiers described being shocked by the quality of American medical organization, the cleanliness of surgical facilities, The availability of medications and supplies, the systematic approach to triage and evacuation that seemed to operate without regard to which nation the wounded man served. She reported to her superiors that American medics and surgeons were treating German prisoners with professional respect, that captured German medical officers were being consulted on cases involving German patients, and that the approach seemed guided entirely by medical principles rather than by any desire for revenge or punishment. For nurses who had witnessed the deterioration of medical care in Germany itself as the war turned against Nazi forces, who had seen medical facilities bombed and damaged, supplies rationed to the point where they ran out before patients ran out, and where medical personnel were increasingly diverted to frontline service rather than rear-area hospital work, the American system represented something almost foreign, a functioning medical apparatus that had not been degraded by years of warfare. That seemed to have unlimited supplies and unlimited personnel, and that operated under principles that felt both civilized and somehow at odds with the realities of war that they had come to accept as inevitable. The most profound encounters between German nurses and American medical care came not in formal hospital settings, but in the aftermath of battles where medical facilities on both sides were overwhelmed and chaos reigned, where the normal rules of military organization broke down, and individuals made decisions based on immediate circumstances rather than official policy. A field hospital located near the Belgian town of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge found itself overrun by German forces during the height of the German counteroffensive in December 1944, with American medical personnel captured before they could evacuate patients or equipment. The Germans occupying the position suddenly faced an unexpected responsibility. Confronted with dozens of American wounded who needed immediate medical attention and a medical facility that had been partially destroyed by the fighting. American medical officers who had been captured were ordered by German commanders to continue treating the wounded. A reasonable request, given that the Germans had their own massive casualty problem and could not spare medical personnel to guard prisoners while also treating the wounded. What emerged from this chaotic situation was an impromptu collaboration between American and German medical personnel, with captured American surgeons and medics working alongside German doctors to treat whatever wounded came through the doors, regardless of uniform. German nurses assigned to the facility observed American medics caring for German soldiers with the same gentleness they showed toward American casualties, seen American doctors working without rest to save German lives, even though those Germans had been fighting to kill American soldiers hours before they arrived in the medical facility. The respect and professionalism demonstrated by American medical personnel in such circumstances created impressions that persisted long after the war ended. That caused German nurses who survived the conflict to reassess their understanding of how different nations approached their medical responsibilities, and that contributed to a broader recognition that American military medicine operated under a different set of principles than what they had experienced in German medicine. The contrast became even more stark when German medical personnel were eventually evacuated as prisoners themselves. When German nurses found themselves in American prisoner of war camps receiving medical care, when they could directly experience American military medicine, not from the perspective of treating German prisoners, but from the perspective of German prisoners receiving American treatment, many German nurses reported being surprised not just by the quality of care available in American prisoner of war camps, but by the attitude of American medical personnel toward their work, the sense that they were bound by professional obligation to care for prisoners just as they would care for Allied soldiers, that there was no differentiation in the standard of medicine provided based on nationality or prior service. The contrast to what had been routine in German prisoner of war camps was stark and immediate. American military intelligence reports from 1944 comparing how different nations treated their prisoners when German military forces surrendered across France and the Low Countries during the spring of 1945. Hundreds of German nurses found themselves captured by advancing American forces, and their immediate introduction to American prisoner of war camp organization and medical administration created a shock that would reshape how they understood what medicine could be when organized according to principles fundamentally different from those they had experienced in Nazi Germany. The Geneva Convention protocols governing the treatment of prisoners of war established that captured military medical personnel should receive special status acknowledging their professional role and permitting them to continue providing medical care to prisoners, a provision that American military command interpreted as requiring that German medical professionals work alongside American medical personnel in caring for the growing population of German prisoners being held in compounds that were hastily established across occupied Germany and in the United States itself. German nurses assigned to prisoner of war hospitals in locations ranging from camps in the American Southwest like Camp Florence in Arizona to permanent facilities established in England and Europe found themselves working within American medical systems that operated according to principles of care, efficiency and professional organization. That seemed almost miraculous compared to what they had known in German military hospitals during the final years of the war when resources had become desperately scarce and organizational capability had deteriorated. Under relentless bombing and strategic collapse, the American military medical system operated with standardized protocols for patient care, systematic approaches to maintaining sanitation in medical facilities, reliable supply chains that provided medications and equipment continuously, rather than sporadically, as resources happened to become available, and professional organizational structures that delineated clear responsibilities and expectations for all medical personnel, regardless of rank or nationality. German nurses working in these facilities observed that American medical organization prioritized patient outcomes above bureaucratic considerations, that American doctors and nurses made medical decisions based on clinical need rather than on political or ideological criteria, that the approach to medicine seemed divorced from any consideration of which nation a patient served or what his potential future utility to military objectives might be. For nurses who had worked in German military hospitals, where decisions about patient care had sometimes been shaped by resource scarcity, so severe it forced impossible choices, about which patients would receive limited medications or surgical attention and which would not, the American abundance seemed almost surreal, a reflection of industrial capacity so far beyond what Germany possessed that it suggested a fundamental difference in the underlying societies rather than merely a difference in military fortunes. The first encounters between German nurses and American medical personnel often occurred in field hospitals, established in liberated territories or in the immediate aftermath of combat where both medical systems were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of casualties, but where professional distinctions and protocols had to be maintained despite the chaos. American surgeons working in captured German hospitals sometimes found German medical officers and nurses already present, still attempting to provide care to German wounded, despite the collapse of military organization and the disappearance of supply chains that had sustained German military medicine. What emerged from these initial contacts was often a kind of improvised collaboration that transcended military conflict, with American and German medical personnel working together to save lives regardless of which nation had issued their uniforms or which military forces they nominally served. German nurses reported being struck by the systematic approach American medical teams employed, even in the most chaotic circumstances, by their commitment to maintaining standards of surgical technique and sanitation, despite shortages of supplies that might have provided justification for abandoning protocols, by their apparent conviction that professional obligations to patients superseded all other considerations, including military victory or strategic advantage. American surgeons operating in field hospitals occasionally deferred to German medical officers' opinions about patient conditions or treatment approaches, creating professional interactions that suggested a conception of medicine as a discipline with universal principles and standards that transcended national boundaries and military conflict. German nurses observed American medical personnel, the repatriation of German prisoners of war and the continued operations of American prisoner of war hospitals through 1946 and into 1947 created extended periods during which German nurses remained in American custody, working within American medical systems and gradually developing deeper understanding of how American medicine was organized and what principles governed its practice. German nurses assigned to permanent prisoner of war hospital facilities in the continental United States worked alongside American nurses and under American military medical command, experiencing American military nursing standards and protocols that operated with such different assumptions about resource allocation and patient care that German nurses found themselves questioning whether their previous experience had been simply ordinary wartime necessity, or whether it reflected more fundamental differences in how the two nations valued medical professionalism. American prisoner of war camps maintained medical facilities that operated according to established protocols for treating prisoners humanely, that provided medications and equipment according to medical need rather than rationing supplies based on assumptions about which patients' lives were more worthy of preservation, that employed trained American medical personnel working alongside German medical professionals to provide care that met professional standards rather than operating under assumptions that prisoner care could be abbreviated or substandard without serious consequences. German nurses working in these facilities observed that American medical personnel treated German prisoners with professional respect, that captured German doctors were consulted on medical matters and their professional opinions were solicited, even though they were prisoners, that the entire approach to prisoner medical care seemed guided by conviction that professional ethics and human dignity transcended the political and military conflict between their nations. The contrast to what German nurses had experienced in German prisoner of war camps during the war, where resources were desperately limited and where prisoner care was often secondary to care for German civilians and German soldiers, was stark enough to create cognitive dissonance that forced German nurses to reassess their understanding of what medical systems could accomplish when resources were available and when political leadership made commitment to treating prisoners humanely a priority, rather than an expendable consideration. American Military Medical Command maintained supply chains that ensured German prisoners received medications necessary to treat infections and illnesses, that provided adequate nutrition to German prisoners even when American soldiers' rations were sometimes limited, that employed surgical teams available to treat German prisoners' serious injuries and conditions with professionalism that reflected standards that would be applied to American soldiers. German nurses participating in prisoner of war hospital operations reported that American surgeons treated German patients with the same skill and attention they provided to American casualties, that American anesthesiologists ensured German prisoners received adequate pain management during surgical procedures, that the entire approach seemed grounded in commitment to professional standards that transcended military conflict and political antagonism. The liberation of concentration camps in late April and May of 1945 created a different kind of medical crisis that forced German nurses and German medical personnel who were captured at or near camp locations to confront the depths to which Nazi medicine had descended and the degree to which ideology had corrupted their profession beyond anything that could be reconciled with principles of professional ethics or human decency. American military medical teams arriving at camps like Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Ravensbrück, and dozens of smaller satellite camps discovered prisoners in conditions of medical horror that challenged every assumption about the medical profession's capacity to maintain ethical standards or about what could happen when medical science was subordinated entirely to state ideology and racial theories that designated certain categories of human beings as unworthy of medical care or even unworthy of continued existence. German nurses and doctors captured at these locations or assigned to assist in the medical response to liberated survivors were often conscripted into providing immediate assistance to concentration camp survivors, a task that created profound psychological disruption as they were forced to confront evidence of what their profession had been complicit in, what their nation's medical system had allowed or enabled or actively implemented through deliberate cruelty and systematic negligence. The contrast between American medical teams working with urgent dedication to save the lives of concentration camp survivors and German medical personnel who had participated in or tolerated systems that brought those survivors to the brink of death created a moral confrontation that seemed to illuminate something fundamental about how professional medicine could diverge between nations and systems that claimed allegiance to similar ethical principles but practiced medicine in radically different ways. American surgeons treating concentration camp survivors worked with precision and dedication, despite encountering medical conditions so severe that treatment seemed almost hopeless. Despite encountering patients so severely malnourished that recovery seemed impossible. Despite encountering injuries and infections and diseases that would have been treatable under normal circumstances, but which had been allowed to progress to terminal stages. German medical personnel observing American commitment to treating camp. Survivors demonstrated understanding that American medicine's principles about saving lives and alleviating suffering represented genuine commitments rather than mere rhetoric deployed when strategically convenient. The systematic American approach to treating survivors demonstrated that medical professionals could maintain ethical principles even when confronted with suffering on a scale that seemed to exceed any possibility of adequate response. That commitment to professional standards could guide behavior even when circumstances were desperate and resources were limited. German nurses who witnessed American medical teams treating concentration camp survivors with dignity and professional dedication, who observed American surgeons working to save lives of people who had been systematically denied medical care by Nazi medicine, confronted the reality that their profession could operate under principles that their own experience had not prepared them to understand. Principles that seemed almost foreign after years of working in a system where medical decisions had been shaped by ideology and resource scarcity that had forced impossible choices about whose lives were worth preserving. The Nuremberg medical trial that prosecuted Nazi physicians for medical crimes, conducted between December 1946 and August 1947, created an international legal and ethical forum where American medical leaders articulated principles of medical ethics that would reshape international understanding of professional medical responsibility and would establish standards that German medicine would need to acknowledge and incorporate if it was going to be reintegrated into the international medical community as a legitimate profession, rather than remaining permanently tainted by association with Nazi medical atrocities. Leopold Alexander, an American neurologist and psychiatrist who served as a key medical advisor to the prosecution, and Andrew C. Ivy, an American physician and physiologist who articulated principles of medical ethics that would become enshrined in the Nuremberg Code, established through testimony and professional argumentation that medical research and medical practice needed to be grounded in principles that protected human subjects from harm, that required voluntary informed consent. For any research participation that established that ethical medical practice could never justify subordinating individual welfare to supposed greater goods or to state objectives. The Nuremberg Code represented an attempt to establish universal principles of medical ethics that would prevent the kind of abuses that Nazi doctors had perpetrated, principles that included the absolute requirement of voluntary informed consent for any human experimentation, the obligation to ensure that benefits of research outweighed potential harms, the requirement that medical professionals maintain right to withdraw from research at any point, and the fundamental principle that the welfare and interests of research subjects must always take precedence over interests of science or state. German medical professionals confronting the trial proceedings and the evidence of medical crimes that emerged during testimony faced a reckoning about whether their profession could be redeemed from association with Nazi atrocities, about whether German medicine could be reconstructed on ethical foundations that would allow reintegration into the international medical community, about whether the medical profession in Germany could regain international respect and credibility after the systematic corruption of medical ethics that had occurred under Nazi rule. German nurses who had survived the war and who had maintained ethical principles despite pressure to abandon them found themselves positioned as examples of what the profession could be when individuals committed themselves to professional principles, rather than subordinating those principles to state ideology or political authority. German medical personnel who had resisted participation in unethical medical practices, who had attempted to protect patients from medical abuse, who had maintained commitment to universal principles of medical ethics despite serving in a system that had systematically attempted to corrupt the profession, became recognized by American medical authorities as individuals whose professional integrity had preserved something essential about medicine even within the context of a criminal state. The recognition by American medical authorities that ethical commitment had been possible even within Nazi Germany created a framework within which German medicine could be reformed and rehabilitated rather than being permanently excluded. German nursing had indeed changed substantially during the Nazi period, with external changes including improved social status of nursing and tightening of professional nursing organizations, though historians and post-war interviews suggest that internal changes occurred as well, with at least a portion of German nurses accepting the National Socialist reinterpretation of professional nursing ethics and humanitarian principles in the assumption that through their obedience to state authority and their participation in state-directed programs, they were doing good, fulfilling their professional obligation to serve the nation even when those obligations meant participating in or tolerating programs that violated fundamental principles of human dignity and the basic obligation of nurses to protect patients from harm. The post-war reconstruction of German nursing involved explicit recognition that these changes needed to be undone, that nursing needed to return to professional principles that emphasized patient welfare and individual ethical commitment rather than hierarchical obedience to state authority and ideological conformity to party doctrine, that nurses needed to be educated and trained as autonomous professionals capable of making independent judgments about patient care and capable of resisting pressure to subordinate professional ethics to state objectives even when such resistance carried professional consequences or placed them in conflict with institutional hierarchy. German nurses who had worked during the war and who continued practicing nursing in the post-war period became voices within their profession, arguing for standards of professional ethics and professional autonomy, contending that nurses needed to be educated as professionals grounded in understanding of ethical principles rather than as subordinates trained to follow orders without question, that the history of how nursing had been corrupted under Nazism needed to be taught to new generations of nurses so that they would understand how professional discipline could be subverted by ideology and would be equipped to recognize and resist such corruption in any historical era or political system. The reintegration of Germany into the international medical community proceeded over the years and decades following 1945 with remarkable speed compared to the depth of Germany's medical system's corruption and the severity of the atrocities that had been perpetrated by some German medical professionals in the name of science or state service, reflecting an American and British strategic judgment that sustaining permanent exclusion of German medicine from the international community would be counterproductive, and that instead, encouraging German medicine's reform and reintegration would promote stability and advance international cooperation in medical science and public health. German medical schools reopened with curricula that explicitly addressed medical ethics and the history of how medicine had been corrupted under Nazism, ensuring that new generations of German physicians and nurses would understand how professional discipline could be subverted by ideology and would be equipped with intellectual tools to recognize and resist such corruption in any era, creating an educational approach that used the Nazi experience not as a shameful aberration to be forgotten, but as a fundamental lesson about the vulnerability of professional disciplines to political corruption and the necessity of maintaining vigilant commitment to universal ethical principles. German medical publications that had been suppressed or had propagandized Nazi ideology were replaced with journals and publications committed to representing international medical standards and to engaging German medicine with the broader international medical community, restoring German medical science to participation in international scientific discourse, and gradually restoring German medicine's standing as a legitimate profession grounded in ethical principles and scientific rigor. German physicians and nurses who had emigrated during the Nazi period or who had survived concentration camps and other Nazi persecution found themselves able to return to German medical practice in the post-war period or to engage with German colleagues in ways that acknowledged both the suffering they had experienced and the possibility of professional reconciliation, grounded in shared commitment to universal medical principles and international standards that transcended national boundaries and historical trauma. The story of German nurses encountering American military medicine and being confronted with principles of universal care that transcended nationalist ideology and military conflict ultimately represents one of the most significant and underappreciated dimensions of how World War II transformed professional ethics internationally, and how the encounter between victorious and defeated nations created possibilities for professional and personal reconciliation grounded in commitment to principles that transcended military victory and national conquest. German nurses who couldn't believe American medics treated their wounded without asking which side they served had encountered something that war had not destroyed, something that transcended national boundaries and political conflict, something that suggested that humanity and professional principle could survive even the most terrible circumstances when individuals and institutions committed themselves to maintaining those principles, regardless of external pressure or political authority, demanding their surrender and subordination to state ideology. The encounter between German and American military medicine demonstrated both that professional ethics could operate as a universal language that united medical professionals across national boundaries and military conflict, and that professional ethics could also be corrupted and subordinated to state objectives when political authority deliberately set out to transform professional discipline into an instrument of state power and genocide. For many German nurses, the post-war years involved reconciling their wartime service in German medical facilities with their post-war understanding of what their profession should have been, acknowledging ways in which they had compromised ethical principles or failed to resist medical corruption, sometimes finding absolution in the recognition that they had maintained ethical standards despite overwhelming pressure to abandon them, other times carrying lifelong guilt about decisions they had made or about their failure to resist programs they eventually came to understand as violations of fundamental human rights. The American refusal to permanently exclude German medical professionals from the international medical community, the willingness to work with German colleagues on post-war reconstruction, and the American articulation of universal medical principles through the Nuremberg Code suggested that American medical leadership understood the profession as something that could be reformed and rehabilitated rather than something permanently corrupted by association with Nazi atrocities, creating a framework within which German medicine could rebuild professional credibility while acknowledging both the systematic corruption of medicine under Nazism and the reality that individuals within that system had maintained ethical principles and resisted medical crimes despite overwhelming institutional and political pressure to abandon professional principles, ultimately establishing foundations upon which the international medical community could build shared understanding of professional ethics that would guide medical practice for the decades and centuries to come, ensuring that what happened in Nazi Germany would not be forgotten, and that professional medicine would remain committed to universal principles of human dignity and ethical care regardless of the political system within which medical professionals happen to practice their profession.